They say that the human heart is like a piece of paper. Once it's been crumpled and torn, you can try to smooth it out, but the lines and the creases stay there forever. For 20 years, I lived with those creases. I folded them neatly into the back of my mind, hidden away behind the busy life of a mother, a teacher, and a survivor. I thought I had finally ironed out the pain. I thought the paper was flat again. But then, yesterday, at exactly 4:12 p.m., the phone rang. The caller ID was a sequence of numbers I didn't recognize, coming from an area code I hadn't thought about in 2 decades. I stared at it for a long time. In this modern world, a stranger's call is usually nothing: a telemarketer, a wrong number, a ghost in the machine. But this vibration felt different. It felt heavy. It felt like a knock on a door that had been boarded up for a lifetime. I picked it up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. The silence on the other end was thick, filled with the sound of ragged, wet breathing and the distant, sterile beeping of a hospital monitor. Martha? The voice was a shadow of the man I once knew. It was thin, like old parchment, and it shook with a fear that I recognized instantly. It was David, the man who had promised to be my rock, only to crumble into sand the moment the wind started to blow. The man who had looked at my bald head and my pale, sickly skin 20 years ago and decided that I was a liability he could no longer afford. "Martha, please don't hang up," he whispered. "I'm in the hospital. My kidneys, they're failing. I've been here for 3 weeks, and the doctors say I don't have much time. I looked through my old contacts. I realized I don't have anyone left. Everyone is gone, Martha. I'm dying alone." I stood there in my kitchen looking at the sunlight hitting the floor, the same floor I had collapsed on 20 years ago when he told me he was leaving. I felt a coldness spread through my veins. He wasn't calling to apologize. He wasn't calling to ask about the children he abandoned or the life he destroyed. He was calling because he was scared of the dark, and he remembered that I was the one who always kept the lights on. He left me when I was fighting for my life, and now he was asking me to hold his hand while he lost his. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story about betrayal, about the strength it takes to survive the people who are supposed to love you and the impossible choice between justice and mercy. This is the story of how I found myself after being left for dead, and what happened when the man who broke me finally came crawling back. Before we go back to the beginning, to the days when the sun still shone on my family, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been left behind by someone who promised to stay? If you have, you know that hearing these stories isn't just about drama. It's about healing. It's about knowing you aren't alone. If you find comfort in these real-life strength and emotional truth, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. By joining our community, you help us keep these voices alive. Your support means the world to us, and it helps other survivors find their way to this circle of healing. Now, let us go back to where the storm first began. To understand the weight of a betrayal, you first have to understand the height of the pedestal the person sat upon. You see, I didn't marry a monster. I married a man who was the sun and the moon to me. If you had told the younger version of Martha, the one with the bright eyes and the unshakable faith in forever, that David would one day leave her at her lowest point, she would have laughed in your face. She would have told you that you didn't know David. We met at a summer festival. I can still smell the funnel cakes and the cut grass. I was 21, finishing my teaching degree, and he was 23, working with a local construction crew. He was handsome in that rugged, effortless way, sleeves rolled up, dirt under his fingernails, and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in a crowd of thousands. When he asked me to dance to a slow country song, I felt a spark that I thought was the foundation of a lifetime. Our early years were a blur of beautiful, ordinary moments. We bought a small house on Elm Street. It was a fixer-upper with drafty windows and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 70s, but to us, it was a palace. We spent our weekends stripping wallpaper and painting the nursery. I remember David standing on a ladder covered in white paint, looking down at me and saying, "Martha, we're building an empire here. A small one, but it's ours." He was a provider, or so it seemed. He worked long hours in the sun to make sure we had everything we needed. When Sarah was born, I saw a side of him that was so tender it made my heart ache. He would hold that tiny baby against his chest, his large hands covering her entire back, and whisper promises to her. 2 years later, when Leo arrived, our family felt complete. We were the quintessential American family. Sunday morning church, followed by big potluck dinners, summer vacations to the lake where David taught the kids how to fish. But looking back now, through the lens of experience, I see the things I chose to ignore. They say love is blind, but I think love is actually a master of making excuses. David loved the easy times. He was the life of the party when things were going well. He was the first person to crack a joke or buy a round of drinks. But whenever life got a bit heavy, David had a way of absenting himself. I remember once when Leo was a toddler, he got a severe ear infection in the middle of the night. He was screaming in pain, and I was exhausted trying to soothe him. David woke up, looked at us with irritation, and said, "I have to be on the job site by 6. I can't be up all night with this." He took his pillow and went to sleep on the sofa in the basement. At the time, I told myself he was right. He worked hard physically. He needed his rest. I handled the fever, the crying, and the long hours until dawn alone. I didn't see it as a warning sign. I saw it as my role. I was the nurturer. He was the builder. I didn't realize that a builder who only knows how to work in fair weather isn't much use when the hurricane hits. As we moved into our second decade of marriage, the cracks began to widen, though they were still thin enough to be covered by the rug of daily routine. David started focusing more on his social life. He joined a bowling league, then a softball team. He was always with the guys. I was home with the teenagers, navigating the complex emotions of Sarah's middle school drama and Leo's quiet struggles with math. I would ask him to stay home for dinner, to talk to me, to just be there. He would sigh, that heavy, burdened sigh that makes you feel like your presence is a chore. "Martha, I work all day. I just need some air," he'd say. He needed air, but I was the one who felt like I was suffocating under the weight of holding everything together. I became the manager of our lives. I handled the taxes, the repairs, the parent-teacher conferences, and the emotional well-being of our children. David was like a guest in his own home, a guest who expected a clean bed and a hot meal, but felt no responsibility for the spirit of the house. I was tired, so tired, but I told myself this was just the middle-age slump. I thought we just needed a vacation, or maybe once the kids were out of the house, we would find each other again. Then came the year I turned 40. It was supposed to be a milestone of celebration. I felt like I was finally coming into my own. I had a rhythm. I was a senior teacher at the elementary school. My kids were becoming independent. I was looking forward to the next chapter. The first sign that something was wrong was a dull, persistent ache in my chest. I ignored it for weeks. I was a mother. I didn't have time to be sick. I chalked it up to stress, to the way David was becoming more and more distant, to the long hours on my feet at school. But the ache turned into a lump, and the lump turned into a terrifying reality that I couldn't hide from any longer. I went to the doctor on a Friday afternoon, alone. I didn't even tell David I was going. I didn't want to bother him with my health concerns unless it was serious. When the doctor came back into the room, his face was a mask of professional concern. He didn't use flowery language. He said the word that every person dreads: malignant. The world didn't stop. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. I could hear a siren in the distance. I could see the dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight. But inside of me, everything shattered. I drove home in a trance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they turned white. I kept thinking about Sarah's upcoming dance recital. I thought about Leo's graduation. I thought about the roses I had just planted in the garden. When I walked through the door, David was in the kitchen looking through the mail. He didn't even look up. He said, "Did the power bill come?" I stood there, leaning against the doorframe, trying to find my voice. "David," I whispered, "I have cancer." He froze. He didn't drop the mail. He didn't rush to me. He stayed very still for a long time, staring at a flyer for a grocery store. When he finally looked at me, there was no pity in his eyes. There was no, "we will get through this." There was only a look of profound, overwhelming inconvenience. "How?" he asked. It wasn't a question of medical curiosity. It was an accusation, as if I had done this to him on purpose, as if I had broken our unspoken contract that I would always be the healthy, strong one so he could continue his easy life. "I have to start treatment on Monday," I said, my voice shaking. "It's going to be a long road. The doctor says it's aggressive." David sat down at the table. He didn't reach for my hand. He put his head in his hands and groaned. "I don't know if I can handle this, Martha. My job is really stressful right now. The timing is it's terrible." I stood there, cold and trembling, realizing for the first time that the man I loved wasn't my partner, he was a passenger. And now that the ship was taking on water, he wasn't looking for a bucket to help me bail, he was looking for the nearest lifeboat, and he didn't care if there was only room for one. That night, for the first time in 20 years, I felt like a stranger in my own bed. David turned his back to me and fell into a heavy, selfish sleep, while I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I was going to fight for my life when the person next to me was already mourning the loss of his own comfort. This was the setup of my downfall, not the disease in my cells, but the rot in my marriage. And as the sun rose on Saturday morning, I had no idea that the man I loved was already planning his escape. They say that adversity doesn't build character, it reveals it. I used to think David had a strong character because he could build a house with his bare hands. I didn't realize that building a life requires a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't show up in your biceps, but in your soul. As the chemotherapy began to take hold of my body, the man I had called my husband began to dissolve before my very eyes. The first few weeks were a blur of nausea, metallic tastes, and a fatigue so deep it felt like my bones were made of lead. I would come home from the clinic and collapse into bed, unable to even hold a glass of water. Sarah and Leo were terrified. They were teenagers stuck in that awkward transition between childhood and adulthood, and suddenly their mother, the pillar of the house, was crumbling. I looked to David to lead them. I looked to him to say, "It's okay, kids, I've got this, I've got her." But he couldn't say it. Every time he looked at me, I saw a flicker of something that looked like resentment. He hated the way the house smelled of medicine. He hated that the laundry was piling up. He hated that I couldn't go out to dinner or laugh at his jokes. He didn't see my fight as a heroic battle. He saw it as a personal insult to his lifestyle. "Do you have to wear that thing on your head?" he asked one evening. I had started wearing a soft cotton turban because my hair was falling out in clumps. It was a vanity I couldn't afford, yet he was the one offended by it. "My hair is gone, David," I whispered. "I'm trying to feel a little bit like myself." "It just reminds me that you're sick every time I look at you," he snapped. "Can't we just have one night where things feel normal?" Normal. That was the word he clung to like a life raft. He was obsessed with normal, even as our world was being torn apart. He started staying late at the office, then he started going to the gym after work. I would hear his truck pull into the driveway at 10, 11 o'clock at night. He would creep into the bedroom, trying not to wake me, but I was always awake. I was lying there in the dark, counting my breaths, wondering if the man who shared my bed even remembered my name. The emotional distance was worse than the physical pain. When you're fighting a disease like cancer, you need a reason to stay. You need someone to look at you and say, "You are still beautiful to me. You are still the woman I chose." David never said those things. Instead, he treated me like a broken appliance that was taking up too much space in the garage. One afternoon, I was particularly ill. I had spent the entire day in the bathroom, and I was shaking with chills. I called his cell phone. It went to voicemail. I called again. No answer. Finally, Sarah came home from school and found me on the floor. She was crying as she helped me up, her small hands shaking. "Where's Dad?" she asked, her voice cracking. He's at work, honey," I lied. I lied to protect him. I lied because the truth was too heavy for my daughter to carry. When David finally strolled in at 8 p.m., smelling of wood smoke and expensive beer, Sarah confronted him. I heard them from the bedroom. "Mom was on the floor, Dad. She was calling you and you didn't answer," she screamed. "I have a life, Sarah. I can't be at her beck and call every second of the day. I'm the one working. I'm the one keeping this family afloat while she just lies there." The silence that followed that statement was the loudest sound I've ever heard. He had said it. He had finally admitted that he saw my struggle as just lying there. He saw my survival as a burden he was forced to carry. From that night on, the mask was off. David stopped pretending to care. He started taking business trips on the weekends. I would find receipts in his pockets for restaurants in the next town over, dinners for two, expensive wine, flowers. I wasn't stupid. I knew what was happening. He was seeking light and joy in the arms of someone who wasn't dying. He was auditioning for my replacement before I was even gone. I remember sitting Leo down. He was so quiet, so much like me. He would sit by my bed and just hold my hand while he did his homework. "Leo," I said, my voice barely a thread, if Dad isn't here as much, I want you to know it's not your fault. He's just having a hard time dealing with things." Leo looked at me with eyes that were too old for a 15-year-old boy. "He's a coward, Mom. We know. You don't have to protect him anymore." That broke my heart more than the cancer ever could. My children were losing their father's respect at the same time they were losing their mother's health. The conflict reached its boiling point on a Tuesday in November. It was raining, a cold, stinging rain that turned the world gray. I had just come back from a surgery to remove more of the tumor. I was in immense pain, wrapped in bandages, and the furnace had skipped a beat. David came home, but he didn't take off his coat. He stood in the middle of the living room, looking around at the clutter, the magazines, the pill bottles, the blankets on the sofa. He looked like a man who had reached the end of his rope. "I can't do this, Martha," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was indifferent. "Can't do what, David? It's cold in here. Can you check the furnace?" "No," he said, staring at me. "I mean this whole life, this sickness, this gloom. I didn't sign up for this. I'm 42 years old. I'm in the prime of my life, and I'm spending it in a house that feels like a funeral parlor." I felt a surge of adrenaline that cut through the pain meds. "You didn't sign up for this. David, we stood in front of 200 people, and you promised in sickness and in health. Did you think that was just a suggestion? I thought we'd be 70 when the sickness part happened. Not now. I want to live, Martha. I want to laugh. I want to go to the beach and not worry about chemo schedules or doctor's appointments. I found someone who makes me feel like I'm not a nurse, someone who makes me feel like a man again." I sat there, my incisions throbbing, watching my husband justify his desertion. He wasn't even ashamed. He felt entitled to happiness, even if that happiness was built on the bones of the woman who had spent 15 years building him up. "So leave," I said. My voice was suddenly very calm. It was the calm of a person who has already lost everything and realized they are still standing. "If your happiness is that fragile, David, then go. But don't you dare look at these children on your way out. You don't deserve to see their faces." He didn't argue. He didn't even pack a full suitcase. He grabbed a few things, his golf clubs and his favorite leather jacket. As he walked toward the door, he stopped for a second. He didn't look back at me. "I'll send money," he muttered. "I'll make sure the mortgage is paid for a few months." "Don't bother," I said. "Just go." The door clicked shut. No slam, just a soft final click. I sat in the dark living room for hours. The rain turned into sleet, tapping against the window like 1,000 tiny fingers trying to get in. I was a woman with stage 3 cancer, 2 teenagers, a broken furnace, and an empty bank account. He had taken the car, the joy, and the future we had dreamed of.
But as I sat there, I felt something strange. It was a tiny spark deep inside my chest, right next to the place where they had cut out the sickness. It was the spark of pure, unadulterated survival. He thought he was leaving me to drown, but he didn't realize that I was the one who knew how to swim. He was just the weight that had been pulling me under. This was the end of the rising conflict. The battle lines were drawn. I was alone in the trenches, and the man I loved was now the enemy who had abandoned the post. But the story doesn't end in the cold. It was time for the long, hard climb back to the light.
There is a specific kind of silence that exists in a house after a betrayal. It isn't empty, it's heavy. It's the sound of the things that should be said, but aren't. For the first few weeks after David walked out, I felt like I was living underwater. Every movement required a massive effort of will. I had to learn how to breathe again in a world where the oxygen had been sucked out. But then something shifted. It happened on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after he left. I was standing in the kitchen, trying to open a jar of peaches for Leo. My hands were weak from the neuropathy, and the lid wouldn't budge. I felt the tears hot and stinging in my eyes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call David and demand that he come back just to open this stupid jar. I looked at the jar, and then I looked at my reflection in the dark oven door. I looked like a ghost, but ghosts don't have work to do. Survivors do. I took a towel, wrapped it around the lid, and I twisted with every ounce of anger I had in my body. The pop of the seal breaking sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I didn't cry. I made the peaches. And that night, I sat my children down. "Listen to me," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "Your father is gone. He made a choice, but we are going to make a different choice. We are not going to be the family that fell apart. We are going to be the family that stayed." That was the true turning point. The cancer was still there, lurking in my blood, but the victim was gone. I began the grueling process of rebuilding. I went back to the school board and asked for a modified schedule. I couldn't stand for 6 hours, but I could teach from a chair. My colleagues, God bless them, rallied around me. They brought casseroles, they drove me to my follow-up scans, they sat with me when the fear got too loud. I realized that David had been right about one thing. I was a burden, but I was a burden worth carrying for the people who actually loved me. And by carrying me, they grew stronger too. The next 3 years were the hardest and most beautiful years of my life. I finished my treatments. I remember the day the oncologist looked at my scans and then looked at me with a wide, genuine smile. "Martha," he said, "you're in the clear. No evidence of disease." I walked out of that office and into the bright afternoon sun. I didn't call David. I didn't even think about him. I went to the park and sat on a bench watching the children play. I realized that David had missed it. He had missed the miracle. He had been so afraid of the storm that he ran away before the rainbow appeared. He had traded the deep, soulful triumph of survival for a cheap, temporary comfort. As my health returned, so did my spirit. I became the woman I was always meant to be, the version of Martha that didn't need a man to be her rock because she had discovered she was made of granite. I watched Sarah graduate at the top of her class. When she walked across that stage, she didn't look into the crowd for her father. She looked straight at me, tapped her heart, and mouthed, "We did it." I watched Leo grow into a man who was the polar opposite of David. He was kind, he was steady, he was the kind of boy who would sit with a friend in tears and never look at his watch. I realized that by leaving, David had inadvertently saved our children from becoming like him. They had seen the cost of cowardice, and they had chosen courage. 20 years passed, 2 decades of life, vibrant and full. I moved to a smaller house, one with a garden that I tended with my own 2 hands. I retired from teaching with a ceremony that filled the school gymnasium. I became a grandmother. My life was a tapestry of rich colors, and the dark thread of David's betrayal had become just a small, almost invisible part of the pattern.
I had forgotten the sound of his voice. I had forgotten the way he smelled. I had even forgotten the way he looked when he was angry. He was a closed book, a finished chapter, a dusty relic of a life I no longer recognized. Until that Tuesday. The phone call from the hospital didn't just bring back a man, it brought back a ghost. David's voice on the line was a jagged reminder of everything I had overcome. I have no one, Martha. Those 5 words carried the weight of 20 years of bad choices. He had spent his life running towards the light, only to find himself at the end of the road in total darkness. He had spent his health and his money on people who only liked him when he was fun. And now that he was heavy, now that he was the one lying in a hospital bed, he had discovered that fun people don't stay for the funeral. I sat in my quiet living room after I hung up the phone. I looked at the photos of my grandchildren on the mantel. I looked at my own hands, spotted with age, but strong. I had a choice. This was the final pivot of my life story. If I stayed home, I was justified. No one in the world would blame me. My children would applaud me for finally closing the door on him forever. He had earned his loneliness. He had planted seeds of abandonment, and now he was reaping the harvest. But as I sat there, I realized that my healing wouldn't be complete until I could face the man who broke me without being broken by him. I didn't want to go because I loved him. I wanted to go because I loved the woman I had become. I picked up my car keys. I didn't tell the kids, not yet. I drove the 3 hours to the city, past the old landmarks of our youth, past the places where we used to dream. I felt a strange sense of detachment. It was like I was driving to meet a stranger. When I walked into that hospital room, the smell of antiseptic and sickness hit me like a physical blow. It took me back to my own dark days, to the cold bathroom floor and the turbans and the nausea, but this time I wasn't the one in the bed. David was unrecognizable. The man who was obsessed with his appearance, with his strength, with his prime, was now a fragile, yellowed, skeletal version of himself. He was hooked up to a dialysis machine that clicked and whirred, doing the work his body could no longer do. He was staring at the ceiling, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes. When he turned his head and saw me, he gasped. It was a wet, rattling sound. "Martha," he whispered, "you actually came." "I'm here, David," I said. I pulled the plastic chair close to the bed. I didn't touch him. Not yet. I just sat there and looked at him. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I was such a fool. I threw away the only thing that ever mattered." I didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't. I didn't say, "I forgive you," because forgiveness is a long road, not a single sentence. I just looked at him and said, "You're not alone today, David. That's why I'm here. Not for the man you were, but for the human being you are now." This was the turning point. The power had completely shifted. He was the one begging for a crumb of the strength I had spent 20 years building. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing him suffer. It was being the person he could never be. It was showing him that even after everything he took, he couldn't take my humanity.
There is a strange, quiet power in being the one who stays when everyone else has fled. For years, I had imagined this moment. If I'm being honest, I had played out versions of this in my head while I was undergoing radiation. In those fantasies, I was usually cold. I was usually the one standing over him, telling him exactly how much he had ruined, watching him squirm under the weight of my righteous anger. But reality is never as sharp as fantasy. Standing in that room, smelling the heavy scent of decay and rubbing alcohol, I didn't feel powerful. I felt a deep, soul-aching sadness for the waste of it all. I wasn't looking at a monster. I was looking at a man who had spent 20 years running away from himself, only to find that he was the only one waiting at the finish line. The first few days were a blur of medical jargon and difficult phone calls. I had to call Sarah and Leo. That was perhaps the hardest part of this entire journey. "He's where?" Sarah's voice was like ice over the phone. I could hear her pacing in her kitchen 3 states away. Mom, tell me you aren't actually in that room with him. Tell me you didn't drive 3 hours to see the man who let you go to chemo alone. I am in the room, Sarah, I said, my voice steady. Why? She demanded. He doesn't deserve your breath, let alone your time. He's a stranger, Mom. He made himself a stranger the night he packed that bag. I know he doesn't deserve it, I replied, leaning against the cold glass of the hospital window. I'm not doing this for him. I'm doing this because I refuse to live in a world where we leave people to die alone, no matter what they've done. I spent 20 years teaching you and Leo to be better than him. If I walk away now, I'm telling you that my kindness was conditional. I'm telling you that I'm just as fragile as he was. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, her anger battling with the values I had instilled in her. Finally, she whispered, I can't come, Mom. I can't look at him, but I understand why you're there. Leo was different. He was quieter. He didn't scream, but he didn't offer to help either. If you need money for his care, I'll send it, but don't ask me to forgive him. I remember what it felt like to be 15 and watch my mother cry in the bathroom because the furnace was broken and the man who was supposed to fix it was at a bar with another woman. I don't have enough room in my heart for him. And so I stood the watch alone. For the next 3 weeks, I became David's advocate. It was the ultimate irony. I sat with the social workers. I argued with the insurance company that was trying to discharge him to a low-rated facility. I brought in his favorite music, the old country songs we used to dance to before the world got heavy. When David was awake, he was terrified. Death is a frightening thing for anyone, but for a man who lived his life entirely for the prime, for the fun, and for the now, the idea of a forever that was empty was paralyzing. Martha, he grabbed my sleeve one afternoon, his eyes wide and yellowed. Do you think they'll ever forgive me, the kids? Do you think they'll come? I didn't lie to him. I couldn't. I had spent too much of my life being honest to start sugarcoating the truth for a dying man. I don't know, David. You broke something very deep in them. You didn't just leave me. You left the idea of father. They've built their lives without that piece. They don't know how to fit you back in. He let out a sob that seemed to shake his entire frame. I thought I had time. I always thought I'd have time to make it right. I thought I'd get rich or successful, and I'd come back and buy their forgiveness. I didn't realize that time is the only thing you can't buy back. You spent your time on the wrong things, I said gently. I reached out, and for the first time, I touched his hand. It was cold and papery. You spent it on the light, and you forgot that the dark is where we grow. In those quiet hours, David began to confess. He told me about the women, the gambling, the hollow feeling he had in his chest every time he saw a family at a restaurant. He told me that he had followed our lives from a distance, social media, mutual friends. He knew Sarah was a doctor. He knew Leo was a coach. He had seen photos of our grandchildren. I used to sit in my apartment and look at their pictures. I'd tried to find myself in their faces, but all I saw was you. I saw your strength. I saw your kindness. I realized that they are wonderful because I left. If I had stayed, I would have poisoned them with my selfishness. That was a moment of profound resolution for me. To hear him admit that his absence was actually a gift, it took the sting out of the last 20 years. It turned my tragedy into a triumph of protection. I had raised them in a vacuum of his influence, and they had thrived. As the days grew shorter, David's body began to shut down. The machines couldn't keep up anymore. The doctors told me it was time to move him to hospice. I found a small, quiet place with a garden view. It was peaceful. I sat with him during his final transition. It was exhausting. I was 70 years old, and my own body was tired, but I felt a strange sense of duty. Not a wife's duty,
That had died long ago, but a human duty. One night, he was drifting in and out of consciousness. He looked at me, his eyes clear for just a moment. "Martha," he said, "why are you here, really? After everything I did, why didn't you let me die in that hospital alone?" I looked at him, and I thought about the woman on the bathroom floor. I thought about the headscarves and the cold house, and I realized the answer was simple. Because I am not you, David. If I had left you, I would have had to live with the memory of a man dying alone. I would have carried that guilt. By being here, I am setting myself free. I am proving that you didn't break the best part of me. You only broke the part that belonged to you, the part that belongs to God and to my children and to myself. That part is still whole, and that part is the one that is holding your hand. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. He whispered, "You were always the strong one. I was just too small to see it." He passed away 2 days later, just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. The room was quiet. There was no drama, no final words of wisdom, just a slow, fading heartbeat, and then peace. I called the kids. I told them it was over. I handled the arrangements. I picked out a simple casket. I didn't ask them for a penny. I used the small savings I had, and I buried him. The resolution wasn't in the funeral. It was in the drive home. As I left the cemetery, I looked in my rearview mirror. I saw the gates closing. I saw the flowers I had placed on the grave. And for the first time in 20 years, the ghost was gone. I didn't feel the weight of his betrayal anymore. I didn't feel the what-ifs. I felt clean. I had faced the dragon that had haunted my nightmares, and I had found out it was just a small, broken thing. I had shown mercy to the merciless, and in doing so, I had completed my own healing. I wasn't just a survivor of cancer, I was a survivor of hate, and as I turned onto the highway, heading back to my garden, my grandchildren, and my life, I knew that the rest of my years would be lived in total, beautiful light.
I'm back home now. The house is quiet, but it's the kind of quiet that feels like a warm hug. It's been a few months since we laid David to rest, and life, as it always does, has moved forward. The grass has grown over his grave, and the world has kept spinning. This morning, I spent 2 hours in my garden. There's something about working with the earth that reminds you of the cycle of everything. You plant a seed, it struggles through the dark, it reaches for the light, it blooms, and eventually it withers and returns to the soil to start again. My life has been no different. I've had my seasons of blooming, and I've had my seasons of deep, freezing winter. But as I sit here on my porch, watching the sky turn from blue to a bruised, beautiful orange, I find myself thinking about the lesson of it all. People often ask me how I could do what I did. They ask how I could sit by the bed of a man who abandoned me when I was dying. They call me a saint, or they call me a fool. But I'm neither. I'm just a woman who realized that holding on to bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. If I had stayed away from that hospital, if I had let David die alone in his own regret, I would have carried a piece of that darkness with me for the rest of my days. Every time I looked in the mirror, I would have seen a shadow of the woman he tried to turn me into. By going to him, I didn't just help him, I rescued myself. I proved that the cancer he brought into my life, the cancer of betrayal and abandonment, was finally, truly gone. I showed myself that I am a person of grace, and that is a wealth no one can ever take from me. My children and I are closer than ever. Seeing me handle David's end gave them a kind of peace they didn't know they needed. Sarah told me the other day that she started volunteering at a hospice center. She said she realized that healing isn't just about medicine, it's about presence. And Leo? Leo has become a man who is so present for his family it brings tears to my eyes. He doesn't just provide, he protects the hearts of the people he loves. David's legacy wasn't the house we built or the money he made. His legacy was the lesson he inadvertently taught us, that you cannot run away from the heavy parts of life without losing your soul.
And my legacy? My legacy is that I stayed. I stayed for my children, I stayed for myself, and in the end, I even stayed for him. To you, sitting there listening to my voice, I want to say this. I don't know what your David is. I don't know who walked out on you, or who told you that you weren't worth the trouble when things got hard. I don't know what kind of diagnosis or heartbreak you are carrying in your chest right now, but I want you to know that you are stronger than you feel. You are not defined by the person who left. You are defined by the person who remained. Your value doesn't decrease just because someone was too blind or too weak to see it. If you are in the dark right now, don't be afraid. The dark is where the roots grow. The dark is where you find out what you are truly made of. And one day, I promise you, the sun will come up. You will stand in your own garden, you will breathe in the fresh air, and you will realize that you didn't just survive, you became someone magnificent. Hold your head high, keep your heart open, even when it hurts, because at the end of the road, the only thing we take with us is the love we gave and the mercy we showed. I'm Martha, and I've learned that life isn't about the people who walk away. It's about the strength you find to keep walking toward the light. Thank you for being with me through this long journey. Thank you for listening to my heart. Before I go, remember to take a moment today to tell someone you love that you are there for them, especially in the heavy times. That's where the real magic happens. Good night, my friends. Sleep well, and may your hearts find the peace they deserve.